Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Ksenia Chmutina. I'm Director of the Institute of Advanced Studies, and welcome to the International House for those of you who are joining us in person today at the International House. And for those who are like me, joining online, welcome. It's really wonderful to host Justin and finally have Justin's seminar. I feel like Justin has been with us for approximately ever in the best possible way. It's just been really wonderful to see him in the International House and engage with him and of course his host Janine through a whole range of activities. And I'm sure you will all really enjoy Justin's presentation today. As always at the International House, we discuss the most exciting, the most important things that I think we all consider and think about. And it's wonderful that today's presentation focuses on children, kind of working with children and hearing about different methodologies that really allow for children to speak and for their voice to be heard is something that is very dear to my heart. So it's going to be very exciting. So thank you, Justin, for that. Couple of housekeeping rules. We are recording this presentation. And it will then be released as a podcast and also as a video on our YouTube channel, but we will not be releasing question and answer session. So any comments, questions will not be recorded. So please feel free to have a very open discussion. For those of you online, please put your questions in the Q&A section and we will be monitoring those. For those of you in the room, just raise your hand and Kieran will help you to navigate this whole thing after the presentation. And also, of course, you can continue the discussion during the lunch that we will be serving after the presentation. On this, I would like to pass over to Janine to introduce Justin. She's been hosting him for months now. So Janine, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming today and to all of you joining online. I felt really privileged being able to host Justin this month. We've had loads of opportunity to really develop our ideas. Justin and I have been working together for a good few years now, and really appreciative of the IAS for inviting Justin over and giving us this time to collaborate both with colleagues at Loughborough, beyond Loughborough, for him to be able to meet some of our PhD students and just sort of embrace the Loughborough atmosphere. It's been really, really great having him here. We've had a lot of fun, but I'm going to let Justin introduce himself. And yeah, over to you, Justin.
Great. Thanks, Janine. And I feel like we've been a big burden on Janine this month because she spent so much time with us. But it's been really fun hanging out at Loughborough, getting to know her kids, getting to know PhD students, which is how I spend all of my time at ODU, is I basically spend it with PhD students. And so it's nice to have met a bunch of you while I've been here. So yeah, let's get into a bit of conversation about some research. And so I'm going to start the same way I started what feels like a month ago now, by just telling you a bit about who I am and what I do. So professionally, I'm the Colgate Darden Endowed Professor at ODU. Old Dominion University is a medium-sized research university. It's not one of the big name brand research universities in the US. In Virginia, we have the University of Virginia, which is name brand. I like to think of ODU as off-brand. So we have cereal called Fruit Loops, which is like the name brand. I think of us as like Fruit Circles, right? We taste the same, but we don't have that fancy packaging. And so that's where we are. We're right like halfway up the East Coast of the United States. I also direct the Center for Movement, Health, and Disability, which is a research and training center at Old Dominion University that we founded in 2019, I think, is when our first year, the first year that we came together. And essentially what we do is conduct research in and train doctoral students how to conduct research in areas related to physical activity, health, movement, and disability. I'm the current editor of Adapted Physical Activity Quarterly, which is our main international publication. First time ever it's been Q1 Journal this year, which is fun. Has nothing to do with what I do, has to do more so with the people who submit papers to it and people who cite it. I'm also the past president of NAFAPA. Personally, I have two daughters named Casey and Emma. I think they're going to walk up here for lunch after this with Janine's daughter, Piper, and then my wife, Jane, will come up with them. So that's the important stuff about me. This is the professional stuff about me, which is important to some people, but not as important as the fun stuff. So, and the second question is, I think, what do I do? And I think a lot about And my research has typically been surrounded around disability and then movement in some context. And I think saying disability first is important because that's where my interests lie. It's not as much in movement and physical education and physical activity. That's just the context in which I work, but it's the ways in which disabled people experience those things. And so there you go. There's really three ways that we situate the work from our center. One is looking at determinants of various health behaviors. We've done some work with the 24-hour movement guidelines, which includes sleep and screen time and physical activity, and the ways in which disabled people experience those and different psychological or physiological outcomes or determinants. A lot of survey research there. We've also done a lot of work looking at national trends, taking the NHANES data set or the NSCH data set and looking at proportions of disabled people who are engaging in movement behaviors as well as other behaviors. We've recently used national drug use surveys to look at recreational drug use among disabled people, which I find really interesting. And I think working in some of those periphery areas of behaviors like drug use is important because it humanizes disabled people to audiences that tend to dehumanize disabled people. But the work that I enjoy the most and the things I think about the most have been the subjective experiences or intersubjective experiences of disabled people. For me, that's far more interesting because you get in more depth, you learn more about people and trying to understand people. So I don't typically use outlines when I present. I typically just start talking about stuff. But I promised to talk about these things, but I think in order to talk about these things, I needed first to talk about where our research started and then thinking about inclusion again. Those of you who were here a couple of years ago when I first got to Loughborough already heard me talk about rethinking inclusion. So it's going to be similar, but I don't think I can get to the works that we currently have in progress without first talking about those things. I'm also going to jump back and forth between notes I have on my laptop and the outline because I try to select words purposely at times, and some of the slides have very purposeful words. So you might see me staring at this. Is that okay? All right, let's get into it. This is where I started in research, thinking about subjective experiences. So when I was coming up through early research, I had some really forming experiences. I used to direct a sport camp for blind and visually impaired kids up in Alaska. I also helped direct one in Connecticut, two different states in the US. Alaska's very far and very cold. Connecticut's very close to New York, where I grew up and where I used to teach with a lot of rich people there. It's basically how I categorize those two places. So I used to run these camps, worked with a lot of blind and visually impaired people. I also spent a lot of time at schools for the blind in the US. I spent a month, just like I spent a month here at Perkins School for the Blind, basically living on campus and getting to know people, learning about the day-to-day life that the kids at the school had. Also a lot of time at the Maryland School. And so a lot of this informed where I started as a researcher because these are the people I cared about. And so I started asking questions, right? So like when I entered my PhD program and I started thinking about research and researching with and about blind and visually impaired people, what I saw first was there was a lot of scholarship about recommending pedagogical practices. So people would say things like, we should do pre-teaching for blind and visually impaired kids. We should use peer tutoring for blind and visually impaired kids. Or people would like examine motor skill development. They'd use an assessment they're using for sighted kids with blind kids and say that blind kids were delayed because they didn't move the same way that sighted kids moved. Or physical activity. People would compare physical activity behaviors between blind and sighted people. And I would do the same stuff because that's the research that I saw as a PhD student, and I thought that's what we're supposed to be doing. And so that's kind of where what I saw in the field, and I started thinking like, I want to start talking to blind and visually impaired people. I don't want to just make assumptions about what they want or why they don't do the things that we believe they should be doing as a field. And so what we started with was attempts to talk with blind and visually impaired adults specifically. And this line really started with this commitment to thinking about and talking to and engaging with blind and visually impaired people about all of these different pieces. And so we started with a couple of different studies, specifically within PE, and basically asked them questions about like, what was PE like for you? We talked to adults first. For a couple of reasons. Probably the most honest reason is it was easily accessible. We are embedded in a community of blind and visually impaired people. It wasn't very difficult to find. I think we talked to 20 something, 16 adults in these papers. But this was the first attempt that we know about to talk to blind and visually impaired people specifically about their physical education experiences. And the findings were pretty telling, right? There's a lot of frustration about physical education and the way that it's constructed. A lot of negative feelings about being viewed as being incapable. There were a lot of very marginalizing peer interactions. The second paper there, that was a master's student paper, talked a lot about how physical education was a missed opportunity to learn about how to be active as an adult, which is at least in the US, that's the purpose of PE. The stated purpose of PE is to train people to be physically active in adulthood. A lot of people thought this context, this educational context, didn't meet that goal. And they basically said that their needs were under-addressed or unaddressed throughout those processes. And so this is some of our first attempts at qualitative work. Not great work, but we learned a lot of stuff. We learned a lot of important things. And I've put a couple of quotes in throughout that were like some of the main quotes from the different papers. This is one of our participants who said, "I knew I was different from other kids at an early age. There was a lot I couldn't do and I couldn't participate in, and the divide seemed bigger in PE than anywhere else." And I think that was a really bad thing because I think it defined me for much of my life as not a physically active person. To me, like, this is a quote that drives continued research in this area, right? The divide seemed bigger in PE than anywhere else in schools. That's pretty important. In a field like ours that's marginalized a lot in a research capacity as well as in a practical capacity within schools, to see that, I think, is such an important spotlight to put on the field and to say, like, we need to figure out how to reconstruct things to move forward. So that's just the first one. We continued to talk to adults. We asked them questions about if they felt included. And this is where some of the timeline gets a little messy between the line of research talking to blind and visually impaired people and redeveloping inclusion. So I'm going to bounce back and forth in the next few slides. But in essence, the participants in this study said, we don't feel included. We're in the same space. We're integrated in the same space. We don't have a sense of belonging, acceptance, and value. But they still wanted to feel that feeling, right? They wanted that feeling within PE. It just wasn't available to them. I think there's a few on this one. I'm going to read the top one because the bottom one's long. And the top one has one of my favorite quotes, which is, "Inclusion is fake," right? The schools would be like, "Oh, we need to have disabled people. Let's include them. So we look good." It's fake. It's overused. And a lot of times it's fake. It's too forced. Schools do it for the look. They want to look diverse, but it has to be genuine. I don't know how it can be implemented. And it's a hard thing because everyone is different. Again, a very telling quote. So we continued on with this line. We talked to more adults. We were talking to them in this paper about, like, where did they feel excluded and what was the role of access within inclusion and your education. And essentially in this paper, which the analysis was done by one of our former students named Nicole Kirk, who's brilliant, there were 3 levels of exclusion, these cascading levels. So first, people were excluded from a physical space. So a lot of our participants were essentially told, even though you're enrolled in this class that you're supposed to be in general PE, we're going to take you and move you to a different space because it's easier for the PE teachers. The participants that got access to the space, that navigated that situation, were excluded from activities, right? So you're in this space, except we're going to have you go sit on a bench because we can't figure out how to integrate you meaningfully into an activity. And then there were some participants who got into the actual activity, except for they were excluded from anything meaningful. So they might have been participating with their peers, but they were essentially told to go sit at a scoreboard. And so we had these 3 cascading levels of exclusion that we saw and that we learned about from our participants. There's a quote about being in a separated room, teachers basically leaving people to just do whatever they want. It wasn't really inclusive. The teacher would be like, well, this is what we're doing. I don't know what else you can do. So go hang out over there on the bleachers until we're done. And this is at a time when we're doing these studies that we keep on reading papers that say things like, just use peer tutoring in schools and it's going to be great. Or use pre-teaching, teach the kid first, and then bring them into the classroom after. All these practical papers that are coming out in journals like the Journal of Physical Education and Recreation and Dance, which is a practice-based journal, or Palestra, which is a practice-based journal, or there's textbooks on this that say like all you've got to do is do the TGMD and your kids will be great. Like these things didn't make sense. And we're starting to cause a little tension and frustration in the US research context because we're writing papers like this where people are saying, here are the negative experience that I've had, where other people are saying, all you've got to do is X, Y, and Z, and the kids will feel included. So we had tension. And for me, that tension was great. For other people, that tension was really uncomfortable. One of the criticisms we got, which I thought was really interesting at the time, was you're talking to adults. We've made a lot of progress since then. You need to talk to children. Seems like a good criticism, right? So we got some funding from this organization called the Spencer Foundation to talk to, I think we talked to in this one, 22 blind and visually impaired teenagers, current experiences, same results, very little progress being made, right? So we spent 2 or 3 years talking to kids. We talked to them over time. We had them do like diaries. So over time they could check in and tell us what's going on. We had monthly surveys we were sending out for them to give us any cool updates. We'd catch up with them over the summer so that they had some like emotional and cognitive separation between school and not school. And for the most part, the feelings were pretty much the same, that they were being excluded from spaces, that feelings of inclusion were restricted, mostly because they were seen as either incapable or a problem or should be somebody else's problem. And that happens a lot in the US as well, because we have adapted physical education professionals whose entire job is to work with disabled kids in schools. And so general PE teachers essentially say it's their problem, not my problem. And the kids know. And I think that's the thing that we tend to not respect, is that kids actually know, right? They feel what they feel. They understand what's happening to them. They know why people treat them certain ways. We went further with this. So in this series of studies, we started to actually ask about very specific teaching practices, right? So people kept telling us it's peer tutoring, that's the answer. Just use peer tutoring. And so we asked the kids, like, what do you think of this idea of peer tutoring? And a lot of the times, they didn't really want somebody assigned to them or trained to work with them. Like I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about my wife is Korean. And I was thinking, like, imagine a situation where there's a Korean kid in a class and somebody has to be trained and then assigned to work with that kid because they're Korean. And I say this in the US and people are like, that's ridiculous. Why would we have to do that for a Korean person? And I think if we think of disabled people as a identity in an area of diversity, then how can we, like, why wouldn't that comparison make sense? How is that not reasonable? So for the kids in this study, it wasn't an obvious choice. They didn't like being highlighted. They didn't like other people seeing that everybody's in a peer tutoring situation, or they're in a peer tutoring situation. They didn't want their peers seeing that. And that happened as well for modifying activities. So like basic modifications, we brought them a list of basic modifications to activities that are being discussed in practice-based journals, and we asked them what they thought about them. And essentially they said that these modifications are mostly band-aids or ways to highlight that they're different than other kids. So that's all US-based research. We've done a good amount of collaboration internationally. These are from Germany, South Korea, and Brazil. Findings are pretty consistent in different contexts. Nothing here from the UK. I'm sure you guys are excellent at including blind and visually impaired kids. It's probably the same though, I would guess. So what did we learn from this line of research, which we have decelerated talking to blind and visually impaired people about PE, mostly because I think that's about 25% of the studies we've done in this area. We've talked to a lot of blind and visually impaired people. We don't know if that, like, just to learn about experiences, I'll tell you later what the next step is. But I don't think improvements have been made. But what we've learned is, even though people are in these integrated settings, feelings of inclusion, which I'll talk about a little bit more, are unavailable within those spaces within the US context, typically unavailable. Are there cases where sometimes they are available? of course. One that comes to mind, I've interviewed this guy 7 years ago. His story still rings a bell in my mind. It was an older gentleman who lived in a small village in Hawaii, whose older siblings were also blind, and they were in a small community where those kids had gone through the schooling process. And because they had gone through the schooling process, the school was a very prepared for this guy when he got to the school, and all of the things that they could ever need for access and feeling valued was readily available. And that's the one person that I remember out of all the people we've interviewed that had only positive experiences within PE. Very interesting. Yeah, so, and the other point is a lot of these things that are happening in PE, modifications, teaching strategies, pedagogies, while we think that they should be helpful, a lot of times they're viewed as inappropriate and belittling from the kids. So that's step one. Step two is this idea of rethinking inclusion. And a lot of you were here the first time I talked, so this is a shorter version of it. But that line of research has led to a lot of the thinking that we have today about how we're conceptualizing inclusion. And by we, I mean the people within our center and the people who we conduct research with. And so for us, and based on the research that I've already shared, the idea of a placement being inclusive doesn't make logical sense, right? Like, if kids are having poor experiences within a class, we can't call that class inclusive, even though spaces are usually assigned the word inclusive, right? So one of the first things that I did in writing about the idea of inclusion was attempting to separate the concepts of inclusion and integration. And so this isn't my idea, it's not an original idea. The first time I heard about this separation, it was from Mae Van Munster at a conference in Sao Carlos, Brazil in 2012. I heard her do it in a presentation. I thought about it a lot, and then I was invited to do a presentation at a conference called NACAHE. This is the paper from that presentation. And in that presentation, we talked about using the word inclusion as an educational philosophy, which we've moved past that already into intersubjective experience, but then using the word integration to discuss a placement. And so for me, the importance here is that before we do this, before we have this separation, it's hard to say, how do we examine the inclusiveness of an inclusive room? Because the word's meaning is very ambiguous. Here, we're trying to introduce concepts to the field so we can start to criticize and problematize integrated placements and whether or not they are inclusive. And this is all based on the phrase that we must place feelings of being included above feeling like we're including. So I had this last time as well. I have this in almost every presentation I give now. It's the same exact slide every time. I don't know what's in the background. It looks like it's a zoom in on a crack on a concrete somewhere. But for me, what this means is instead of thinking about us as stakeholders and how we feel about what we're doing, which is what I believe a lot of faculty in the US do, we need to start thinking more so about how people that we're trying to serve within these educational settings feel. So it's my favorite quote for research. I don't remember where it came from anymore. But so that quote led us to this idea of continuing to think about and define and redefine and shape what we think inclusion means. And so for us, inclusion must be thought of as more than just this disconnected and disembodied state or place, physical existence within a space or a place, and more so about how people feel while they're within these spaces. And so that led to this paper that I worked with a guy whose name I won't say from Leeds Beckett University up the road, who said he was going to come today, but he's not here. So just kidding. We always knew he wasn't coming. But what we did in this paper is try to create the argument for extending inclusion beyond material and toward intersubjective feelings of acceptance, belonging, and value. We're not the first people to use acceptance, belonging, and value. The first people in our field to do it were Nancy Spencer and Jane Watkinson, I believe, in 2010 for Nancy's dissertation work. And she borrowed it from someone else. And you can see that none of us really make anything up ourselves. We're basing everything on somebody else's something, just like the title of this presentation apparently is the same as Janine's thesis. I knew, of course, right? But so as we're developing this, we're talking about this shift in power from stakeholders saying, we're inclusive, we're doing inclusive things. If you do X, Y, and Z, your kids will be included within PE, toward acknowledging that students have a voice and that voice is important in constructing whether or not people feel included within their classes. And so we've seen this used more than I expected after we wrote the paper, in papers in different contexts. I'm surprised that it's caught on a little bit. It's a little American English for you. We've also, because of that paper, we had conversations with people saying, like, if that's what inclusion is, what's exclusion? And it's a good question. Is exclusion the absence of feelings of acceptance, belonging, and value? That doesn't seem like it makes much sense. And so we've had to write another paper about exclusion, and we used psycho-emotional disablement from the social relational model and ableism to think about how to rethink exclusion. We've got a few other conceptual papers that are out on other topics related to inclusion, if you want to keep reading that type of stuff, which I find really fun, but also really difficult to write. And so the main thing here is that it matters less if what we see or hear is indicative of what we think of inclusion and exclusion, and what matters more is how people feel and whether they feel included or excluded as active agents with it, or interacting with it and connecting to others in those spaces. That's the most important thing to me. And that also is the big overlap between this and that first line with the blind and visually impaired people. While we're having those conversations with blind and visually impaired people, we're also thinking about inclusion, and we're talking about inclusion. And so those weave back and forth over time. And so it was really hard for me to think of the order of this, actually, to explain what we've been doing. One more important piece here is the spatial element of inclusion. And so historically, we think about inclusion just as an integrated space. We think about exclusion as separated spaces. With this conceptualization of inclusion and exclusion, it can happen in any space, right? This is a pretty big disagreement I have with a couple of the American scholars about where inclusion is possible. But for me, if somebody's in a space and it's all disabled people, why should we say they can't feel accepted, belonging, and a sense of value? It doesn't make any sense to me to say that it has to happen where there are non-disabled people. I think that's pretty offensive. Going back to the Korean example, if you say Koreans can only be accepted around other Koreans, that's racism. How would this not be ableism? And again, important piece here is that the central feature of these conceptualizations is that we must be engaging with the voices of disabled people themselves to enable them to make themselves heard and have their perspectives available in the construction of their experiences. We can't tell people whether or not they feel included. And equally, we can't say that strategies, placements, curriculum are inclusive. When inclusion and exclusion are experiences, there's really no strategies or setting, or one of the biggest gripes I have is observational checklists that can determine if someone is or is not included or excluded. You can't check a box and say someone's included. Yeah. All right. Look at that. Technology is not my thing. So those are like the foundational steps toward what we've been working on more recently. And I'm not one to say I know what I'm doing. I think research is a learning process. And so I use research for me to learn about how to do research. And so what we've moved into now is thinking about how to reimagine PE, and to do so from a disability justice and a social justice lens. I don't know if reimagining is the correct word. We've had reviewers tell us that we shouldn't use reimagining, which is fine. Maybe it's a different thing. But I think this line of inquiry is interesting. essentially, I want to talk with people about how we can do this better instead of continuing to do it in ways that's marginalizing. And so we've started with talking with APA professionals or APE professionals, so adapted PE teachers and faculty. And there's some interesting irony to that I'll share soon. But this concept was driven by the idea that we have to shed the presupposition that PE for disabled kids must start and sometimes end with what general PE curriculums and activities look like. So the first thing we want to do is get rid of the idea that just because PE looks like one thing for non-disabled kids, it doesn't mean that that's what PE has to look like for disabled kids. And rather, we want to do what we seem to have done historically for non-disabled kids, which is we want to construct pedagogies, curriculum, spaces, so on and so forth, PE training in ways that focus on developing capabilities of disabled kids to be lifelong movers, right? So when we develop PE for non-disabled kids, we in the US, our goal is to get them to be lifelong physically active. But that's not the goal of APE. That's not the goal of PE for disabled kids. The goal for PE for disabled kids has historically been put them in the same space. So if you asked faculty about or teachers about the goal of PE for disabled kids in the US, a lot of times it's how do we create access into the space that exists for non-disabled kids? And maybe non-disabled kids will have less bad attitudes toward disabled kids. It's mind-blowing to me that that's what we say. And so we want to focus on that goal of developing PE in ways that supports lifelong physical activity for disabled kids, while also focusing on feelings of acceptance, belonging, and value. So those are our two guiding principles in this line of research. And so we tried it for a first time. The first attempt at thinking about this, we posed questions about reimagining PE to adapted PE professionals in the US. And this paper is now in the Journal of Teaching and Physical Education. And first, when we talk to these APE professionals to think about this utopian PE environment and what it might look like for disabled kids. And again, to develop PE for physically literate adults, the participants were really quick to say that there's no way to fix this and that reimagining PE for disabled kids would be arduous, uneven, difficult task. People basically said that doesn't seem reasonable or possible or practical. And I really like things that aren't practical. Many said to get to a place of reimagining, or they couldn't get to a place of reimagining because that transition might be impossible. But when they started to provide some ideas, it took some time. They brought up things like physical space and place, suggesting that general PE could or should take a backseat to other spaces or places, which I think is telling. Other elements that were critical were community-based programs where disabled kids can learn about physical activity that they might participate as adults, learn in those settings while they're kids, essentially. So one of the things that happens in schools occasionally is if we're going to teach bowling, we'll take the kids to the bowling alley. So those generalizable skills aren't just taught in some contrived environment. We'll go do it in the environment so they can learn how to access the skill while they're doing it. Makes sense, right? So instead of just doing bowling, we would identify where they're going to engage in fitness activities, what gyms they're going to go to, what physical activity opportunities exist within the environment or in the town or city or county, and teach them how to do those things within those towns. But again, they thought this was idealistic. Resources were not available. It didn't seem possible in the way that schools currently operate. Maybe it's not possible. Sometimes utopia isn't possible. But we realized while we're doing this, that the way in which we were doing it was flawed. And this approach was problematic and one that was actually quite philosophically incompatible with the way in which we work. And so we, as I said in the beginning, we want to explore how disabled people experience the world, and we engage with disabled people about that. And the first thing we did in this line of reimagining was talk to non-disabled stakeholders about disabled people. And so here's a bunch of fancy writing. A lot of it came from a paper that Janine wrote not too long ago that a couple of us got to participate in about epistemic injustice, about describing the reasons why what we were doing was incompatible with the way we think about research. And I think this is important to share, especially because we have PhD students here, to show that we do stuff that doesn't make sense somewhat often. And by doesn't make sense, I mean doesn't align with our philosophical assumptions or statements. And sometimes you have to do that stuff to get to the next thing you're going to do. So if you were to guess, you'd probably guess that the next thing that we did is we took what those APE professionals said and we brought them to visually impaired people to find out what they thought about the various opinions of the APE professionals. And so we started with providing the same instructions we provided those APE professionals, which was think about PE and what you remember about PE and how would you reconstruct PE if you could in order to meet your needs so you could become physically literate adults. And then we also provided the answers that the AP professionals provided about it being an arduous task, about it not being simple, but also with these ideas of community-based instruction and space and place. And the responses were quite interesting. And this paper isn't published anywhere yet. We're having good arguments about it with reviewers for a journal. But maybe the most important aspect that we learned in this one was that the participants had somewhat limited abilities to reimagine what PE looked like. I think you can guess part of the reason is they don't have professional training or experience or background knowledge in physical education outside of their own personal embodied experiences. And so without that, a lot of them were very uncomfortable to say like this could change and this could change because they don't know the other side of the aisle. Ironically, the APE professionals didn't have that much of a problem with them. But with that, they still had a lot of ideas. And so we had 3 themes come out of it. The first theme offered the participants direct critiques of the motivation and knowledge of their PE teachers, where they thought reimagining PE for visually impaired students specifically started with reimagining their teachers, which I thought was really interesting. They talked about their teachers' role as an educational oppressor, as well as how experiences that they had are mediated and dictated by the knowledge, capabilities, and interests of their teachers. I think this has big implications that I'll talk about soon. The second theme shared the participants' views on the context of PE, offering suggestions to reimagine where instruction took place while bringing to light recognition of their identity as being oppressed within PE. And so this aligns really well with the AP professionals' ideas that space needs to change. It can't just be one fixed location. And the last theme describes the participants' ideas on how to reimagine activities implemented within those spaces, which they linked inherently to the PE teachers' beliefs and attitudes and so on and so forth. So the big implication that we saw with this one, I'm going to focus on these notes because, again, choosing words. While there's been a lot of work out there that's problematized how PE teachers' behaviors impact disabled students, I actually thought this implication was an opportunity to shine a light on how PE teachers are trained within the US and consider ways to challenge and offer new practices to reconstruct training for pre-service teachers. And so for me, in order for us to help reimagine PE in schools, I think it's time that we actually reimagine the ways in which PE teacher education programs like the one that I work within train pre-service teachers working with visually impaired students. Typically, when we talk about changing PE and changing APE teacher education, we only talk about we need more hours, right? We talk about time and magnitude, but we don't talk about what we do in those classes, right? So in the US, when we talk about disability within a PE program, we talk about diagnoses and etiology and some behavioral characteristics. We don't talk about things like engaging with blind and visually impaired kids or disabled kids, strategies to listen to and reconstruct what you're doing based on what you're learning from disabled students. We talk about ways to raise students' efficacy or pre-service teachers' efficacy. But what we're raising, but if the typical practices that are happening within PE are ableist, are creating marginalization and oppression, then all that efficacy is doing is increasing teachers' ability to be oppressive and marginalizing. It doesn't make sense to me to focus on their efficacy. It makes sense to me to talk to them about ways to think about what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. And so that's something that is a work in progress. I don't have an answer for how we need to train PE teachers to work with disabled students, but what I do think is the way that we're currently doing it is what is supporting marginalization within schools. I believe we're training PE teachers in PE programs in the US to mistreat disabled students and to be okay with it. So I think there has to be some training to help think about ableism and deconstruct the deficit-oriented thinking that's currently within our schools. I think of TGMD assessments as a great example of this, which is the test for gross motor development, where we have an assessment that's built on non-disabled kids, that we ask disabled kids to move like those kids. And if they don't, then what we do is say, let's do an intervention to make you move like a non-disabled kid. It just doesn't really make sense. The second big implication for me is that when we talk to the AP professionals, they clearly didn't have knowledge. The knowledge they were missing was the knowledge of the kids. When we talk to blind and visually impaired people, they clearly didn't have a very large segment of knowledge from the professional aspect. So for me, for us to continue this reimagining work, it has to be done collectively. It has to be done by bringing both of these groups to the table to talk about and talk through ways to reimagine PE together. We probably need admin also, because without admin, none of these utopic ideas will actually come to. But at a starting point, I think it's teachers and kids. And so the work in progress that I'll share is exactly that. And so our next big step with our center will be a project that we are hoping to bring together groups of blind and visually impaired students with teachers within the state of Virginia to develop pedagogical, curricular, spatial ideas for how to teach blind and visually impaired kids within public school physical education. It seems like something that probably should have been done 40 years ago when this field of adapted physical activity was founded. But I don't think that this type of stuff has yet been done, to my knowledge, at least in the US, maybe here in the UK. So we want to develop it, and then we want to embed it within pre-service training so that it gets dropped into the acculturation and professional socialization processes for pre-service teachers. And we also need to embed it into or in-service education so that teachers can get better at what they're doing while kids are in their classes. And so, again, like everything else that I was talking about before, it's going to be rooted in inclusion as an intersubjective experience and support that goal of PE to develop lifelong physical activity. And we want to dismiss this idea that it has to look like what PE looks like for everybody else. Let's focus on the objectives. Let's focus on inclusion as intersubjective experiences. If it looks different than what PE looks like for non-disabled kids, I think that's okay. So it's a work in progress. I was told to talk about a work in progress. And we partner with the Virginia Department of Ed for this, as well as a statewide parent group for kids that are blind and visually impaired called they're the Virginia chapter of the National Federation for the Blind. And so they're excited about it. We have funding applications currently being reviewed, went back to the Spencer Foundation. We're hoping that we can get the support to make this happen, because this is a big endeavor that we need to support a lot of blind and visually impaired kids as research team members. We got great criticisms years ago about not treating participants like partners and paying them adequately to be participants in research. So that's something that's really important to us. And you can see a lot of the things we do is based on the mistakes that we've made in the past. We make a lot of mistakes. But so that's what I have. from our current research or past research and future research. Those of you that don't have my email address, I answer emails pretty fast. I'm happy to talk about all this stuff or answer questions. I think we have time for questions. So yeah, that's what I got. Thanks for being attentive and for the positive affirming head nods.